Welcome to the future. Thank you for joining me for episode 2 of Seeking Delphi. I'm Mark Sackler. Today's program features part 2 of my interview with David Wood, chair of the London Futurists and author of the book, The Abolition of Aging. In the first installment, I spoke with David regarding his bold forecast of a 50% probability of widely available and affordable rejuvenation therapy being available by 2040. But as daunting as it may seem to reach this anti-aging pinnacle, getting there may be far less than half the challenge. The bigger question is what happens to the whole of human society, indeed the very foundation of human civilization, if we do get there. What happens to retirement, to the environment, to work, and to the very meaning of human life? Will we still be human as we know the term today, or will we effectively evolve into something else? Here now is part 2 of my interview with David Wood as we deal with some of these questions. I am back with David Wood, chair of the London Futurist and author of the book, The Abolition of Aging. In our previous discussions, we talked about the feasibility, the timeline, the areas of research going on to make age reversal therapy the real thing. In this segment, we're going to talk about something that obviously grows out of that possibility, and that is the implications. What does it mean for human society, for the entire human experience? Because this would obviously be perhaps one of the greatest, if not the greatest, paradigm shift in human history. It would almost be kind of evolutionary leap in one fell swoop. So, David, let's start with the whole concept of retirement. What happens to that? Is it completely gone in one fell swoop? Does it gradually go away? What happens?
So it's a pleasure to be here, Mark. I think this is a very important discussion. I think that as people have a revitalized body and brain and mind, they will be able, if they wish, to throw themselves into a large number of different tasks, occupations, pastimes. And I think the present notion that you spend a while learning when you're young, then you go through a career, and then you go through a phase of retirement and diminishing strength and vigor led to death, this will go away. And instead, we will have the prospect of people continuing to be a full member of society in every way for as long as they like, and by the way, with education happening throughout as well. This doesn't mean, however, that I think people will be undergoing employment for pay. And to explain that, I think we have to take into account the fact that the rejuvenation biotechnology will not happen in a vacuum. There will be many other applications of new technology in parallel. And in particular, we have to look at the improvements in automation, which means that most of the work that most people do will be done better by robots of one sort or another, whether it's software robots or hardware robots. So, for example, today in a large number of states in the United States, the largest employment description is truck driving. And we recognize the real prospects that long before 2040, in fact, possibly within 5 or 10 years, most trucks will be driven instead by robots, that is, by self-driving cars. So there will be large changes to what people do for work happening independently of how successful the rejuvenation biotechnology takes place. And so I envision a bigger change ahead. It's not just that we're going to be doing everything else the same except we're living longer. In fact, we have the chance to have, as you described it, an evolutionary leap forward in which we are not just longer lived but able to be more creative and have many more experiences, provided we can reorganize society in a sensible way that takes advantage of the benefits of technology and distributes these advantages in fair share to everybody.
In terms of reorganizing society, clearly one of the biggest issues here is if people aren't dying and they're still reproducing, what's going to happen with what could be theoretically an exploding population? What about resources? There are those that feel we're already exceeding the carrying capacity of the Earth. Do we wind up having to limit reproduction the way China did decades before they recently rescinded that?
So the short answer is no, I don't envision that we're going to have to restrict reproduction. But to explain that, I must start off by saying I think this is a very serious topic, and we are at risk currently of doing serious damage to the planet because of our extravagant lifestyles, because we are using many of the precious resources of the environment in a very profligate way, and we are emitting wastes of all sorts, which have the potential to damage the environment, damage the climate, cause accelerated climate change. So these are serious topics, but I believe they are within the bounds of our ingenuity to address and fix. So to break it down, first of all, how much population could the Earth hold? Is 7 billion the maximum? And I would say we're far from that. There's plenty of land on the Earth which hardly has any humans in it at all. 50% of the Earth's population lives in just 1% of the available land mass. Lots of the other parts of the land aren't very fit for living in, but with sufficient application of science, we can transform them if we wish. We can take back a lot of farmyard land, which is currently used very inefficiently, to give over to cows, to turn vegetation into beef. In the future, we'll be able to do that much more efficiently in the lab. So there's plenty of space on the planet for lots more people than currently exist. In fact, even if the world's population were to double, and by the way, if nobody died anymore, and I know that's an extreme proposition, but if people stopped dying, particularly stopped dying of aging, it would still take probably at least a century on that ground alone for the population to double. And even if the population doubled, we could fit everybody on the planet into the state of Texas, with each of them having more floor space than the size of the average house in the United Kingdom. I'm not saying that's what we should do, because of course there are many other things we need for the planet beyond our living space, but there is no shortage. The bigger issue, as I said earlier, is our waste and our use of energy. I think that we have just around the corner new green technologies, whether it's solar energy or wind energy, other interesting sources of energy to look after a much larger population than we've already got. We can turn that into good food. If necessary, we can use some of that energy to desalinate salt seawater and create plenty of fresh water. The biggest problem is how are we able to live without causing the environmental damage? And that's requiring a political change as well as a technological change. And things are still up in the air whether that is going to be solved or not. That's why I have gone on record in saying I think there's probably at least a 30% chance that by 2040 we'll be in a much worse world than we are today if we don't solve these problems. But the differentiator that will end up choosing between these very bad outcomes and the very good outcomes is not how many people we've got on the planet, it's how good a political discussion we'll be able to have about taking advantage of the technologies which we already have.
Let's move on to a concern that I have. You say 50% chance of affordable rejuvenation therapies by 2040. Of course, the definition of affordable is different in the UK or the US than it is in, say, Bangladesh or Nigeria. I foresee the serious potential for a two-tier society with the rejuvenation perhaps haves and have-nots. That would be the have-nots being people that can't afford it, that don't have immediate access to it, or perhaps some who choose not to have the therapy, which is a very real possibility as well. There are those out there who have stated very strongly, even in the scientific community, that people ought to die within their number of years and make room for a new generation. There are also those with religious objections. So what do you see the implications of a two-tier society where there are still people who are going to die, and even in the West who maybe want to retire? That's going to, I would think, create some tensions in society.
There are big risks of tensions ahead. And we would be naive just to imagine that it's all going to come out nicely and easily due to the miracle of technology and the miracle of free market economics, as people say. It's true that some goods start off expensive and then become increasingly affordable. And I look at smartphones or flat screen TVs, many other items of consumer electronics. Initially, they were just available for the really wealthy, and now they are widespread because market forces have driven down the prices. But I don't think this applies universally. And if we look at many medicines, the cost of accessing insulin, the cost of actually accessing some of the treatments for cancer are exorbitant. And there are many treatments which are not easily available in the developing world. In fact, there's a whole thing called neglected diseases studied by the DND, an initiative to look at neglected diseases, things which could easily be solved if we put our minds to it, but the big pharma isn't particularly interested in solving them because there isn't much money to be made because the people who get these diseases are pretty poor. So we have to take social action to head off these risks, in my view. This is why it has to be a mass interest rather than being left just to a few rich and successful people to pursue.
Along those lines, in his iconic Mars trilogy, Stanley Robinson foresees a time when rejuvenation therapy, anti-aging genetic therapy, which he foresees in his books beginning in about the 2030s or 2040s, right around your time frame, a time when it is actually in the U.S. considered a right and the government actually pays for it. Do you think a scenario like that is viable, potentially possible?
I think it will be very much in the interests of governments to pay for such treatments in the same way the governments often subsidize other things for the well-being of their citizens. And it is the right thing to do. And it is also a socially enlightened thing to do. If we don't do this, there is the risk of tremendous anger, tremendous alienation, and tremendous disquiet.
There is the potential, I think I see, for a trade-off is that if you make people younger and they don't get the diseases of aging, healthcare costs go down, long-term care costs go down. Effectively, while robots are taking jobs in other areas, maybe this kind of takes jobs in healthcare. There just won't be as much sickness.
Well, that would be a great thing. People call it the longevity dividend, a bit like the peace dividend that people spoke about in the past when we could beat swords into plowshares. So in the same way, if we invest sufficiently in preventive medicine, in reversing the effects of aging before they degenerate into horrible chronic diseases, we will end up having to spend a lot less overall. And there are economists who have looked at this. Chapter 9 of my book, as I remember, is all about the economic arguments for why enlightened governments ought to be investing a lot of money in the short term to avoid needing to spend even more money in the medium term looking after the chronically ill.
Interesting stuff. So one final area to look at, and one of the arguments you hear against this is that we need youth for innovation, for new views, for a fresh look at society. If most people are old, and one would assume that birth rates, even if they're not controlled by the government, are going to continue to go down, particularly if people are living indefinitely. How do you feel about that, of having a lesser and lesser percentage of young people in society? They do sort of give us a kind of energy, after all.
So it's my view that we'll all be young. It's my view that even though we are chronologically old, we will be rejuvenated in our spirit as well as in our bodies. And as a result of this rejuvenation, we will be back in a whole flux of innovation and new ideas. Having said that, I also believe there probably will be new children brought into the world, not necessarily through organic wombs inside their biological mothers, but we're not too far away from the technology of ectogenesis, by which people could choose if they wish to grow babies in synthetic wombs outside of the body. So I believe it's possible that over time people will probably have more children. assuming that people are comfortable that there will be plenty of space and plenty of reason to bring them into the earth. So these are two reasons why I think we'll have lots of youth. Today, elderly people are sometimes a bit crusty and conservative, but not always. And there are plenty of counterexamples of older people who are full of innovation and novelty still, despite their numerical large age. And I believe we can get that liveliness of spirit to be something that's much more widely adopted.
So one final thing, let's imagine something maybe a little out there, and I'm again gonna draw from Stanley Robinson and his Mars trilogy, where he foresees a time when there is tremendous pressure on Mars to accept lots of immigrants from the Earth, because with the population more than doubled with rejuvenation therapy, there are still issues with resources, with ecology. Some of them are managed, but it's not a perfect world, and there are serious problems. I mean, do you foresee more pressure to move out to the solar system and the stars as a result of this?
In due course, absolutely. In due course, though we may not get there for 100 years, and by then we'll have much more capabilities in our disposal. There will be a desire, a need to grow, first of all, larger and larger skyscrapers, to grow cities on the sea, which there's lots of sea space in which we could, if we wish, grow cities, and then to grow cities in a different kind of sea, which is outer space, with space stations built by nanotechnology of the future, reusing the contents of the asteroids and other things. So I think that future lies ahead of us, provided we can get through the very difficult few decades that are ahead. And if we choose wisely, we will have that very positive Humanity Plus future, rather than what is still a realistic and dreadful possibility, which is a new dark ages, effectively.
Well, David, thank you so much for your time and your input. Interesting stuff. And I'm at a stage of life, I hope I can hang on long enough to see some of this transpire.
Good health to you.
My talk with David Wood only scratched the surface on implications of radical longevity extension. And as for the question of whether we do it, it's evident from the entirety of the two-part interview that he strongly believes we should. My views? On the implications, there are two issues in particular that fascinate me. The first is the whole paradigm of retirement and Social Security. What will become of it in a two-tiered society where some individuals either choose not to take advantage of rejuvenation therapy or simply don't have access to it? What if it costs $100,000 to make one effectively 20 years younger? Even in the developed West, the majority would have difficulty affording this. One solution might be to have government pay for the therapy, but require recipients to then defer receiving Social Security and Medicare benefits for 20 years. That would be a win-win. But what happens when some people pay for it themselves? The only way to prevent indefinite terms of benefits might be to place a lifetime cap on them. And second, there is the 800-pound existential gorilla in the room. What happens to the very meaning of life and humanity if one might live to 150, 200, 250, or even more? Will the whole purpose of life change? Perhaps it will constantly change during one's indefinitely long extended lifetime. Which brings us to the question, should we do it? I argued this point some time ago with a pharmaceutical industry colleague. He opposed the idea for some of the very reasons I discussed with David Wood: overpopulation, lack of sustainability, lack of youthful worldview renewal. I simply countered with the proposition then that he had no business in the pharmaceutical industry, as 80% of what we were doing in it was to treat the diseases of aging. He had no answer for that. In simplest terms, the genie is out of the bottle, the research has gone mainstream, the investment is pouring in, not just from biotech, but from the magnates of industry and technology. Quite simply, if it can be done, it most certainly will be done somewhere and somehow. There is almost no way to stop it. Nobody can say for sure if any of the current or future efforts will succeed, but we had better be prepared with some new ideas if they do. Moving on to this week's future-related news, Business Insider reported that the fastest-growing jobs in the U.S. are in renewable energy. Solar energy jobs are growing 12 times faster than the U.S. economy, and the fastest-growing single job title is wind turbine technician. Also from Business Insider was an interview with Ford CEO Mark Fields, who said he envisions the company moving into urban planning within the next 15 to 20 years, and that a more holistic approach to all forms of transportation is a likely direction for the company. Meanwhile, GM and Honda were announcing a joint venture to manufacture fuel cells in a new Detroit factory slated to begin operation in 2020. Fuel cells will be the topic of an upcoming interview on this program. And finally, Forbes magazine reported that scientists say the Earth's rotation, under the influence of the moon's gravity, is slowing by about 2 milliseconds per century. At that rate, our day will be 25 hours long, in about 180 million years. So don't forget to set your clocks back. Thank you for joining me. My technical advisor is Mohammed Maroof. The writing and production is all mine. And until next time, I'm Mark Sackler.